Shabbat Shalom. On behalf of the Israel Action Committee, I have the honor of introducing our speaker, Oren Kessler. Very briefly before I do, I wanted to mention the handout this morning, the Declaration of Independence of Israel in English. I urge you all to read it, even if you've read it before, read it again. I think it's an important reminder of the historical context in which the State of Israel was created and of the first principles that are stated in there and are hopefully enshrined in the minds of the members of the Knesset. And thinking about recent developments in Israel, both among Jews and between Jews and Palestinians, it's very apparent to most of us that we can't really understand what's going on there today without knowing a lot of history. Not even just the history of the state, but the history that precedes the state, the whole history of the Yishuv. And I believe Oren Kessler has performed a very important service, both for us and for the world, through his new book, Palestine 1936, The Great Revolt and the Roots of the Middle East Conflict. It recounts in a very compelling way events that took place during a very critical period in Israel's history, and it has made me see the conflict in a more complex way, and I think it would do that for you as well. Oren Kessler, who's now based in Tel Aviv, grew up in Rochester, New York, has degrees from University of Toronto and Reichman University in Herzliya. And he was formerly Deputy Director for Research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies in Washington. He was the Arab Affairs correspondent for the Jerusalem Post, an editor and writer for the English edition of Haaretz, and his work has appeared in many publications, including the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, Politico, Foreign Affairs, and the New Republic. And we're very grateful that he could join us this morning.
Well, thank you very much, David. Shabbat Shalom lekulam. Let's see here. Thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to Temple Emmanuel, to David, of course, to Avi Zeidman and Fernando Huergo, who helped put this together. My dad is here this morning. This is my very first book event that he's attended. And my dad, along with my brother and my girlfriend, were my very first editors on the manuscript of this book. So if anyone's read the book and has any criticisms or complaints, he's seated right there. But if anyone has any praise, you just come right to me. Cut out the middleman. So I've got limited time here, so I'm just going to kind of talk about some key themes and some key events of this book and the genesis of how I came to write it. About 5 years ago, as David mentioned, I was working at a think tank in Washington, D.C., and we parted ways for reasons that I won't get into here, but I got the inexplicable urge to write a book on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I realized it was time that someone finally wrote about this conflict. But I realized quite quickly that quite a few people have written about this conflict. There are quite a few books about this conflict, apparently. And so I was quite discouraged for a while until I sort of lit upon this particular chapter, this particular period in the history of the land of Israel, in the history of the Israeli-Arab conflict. And it struck me that it was an extremely decisive and pivotal and formative event, and one that had not nearly gotten its due in English. There's no book on this period of 1936 to 39, on the Arab Revolt and everything that emanated from it. There's no book for a general audience in English. There's some very academic stuff, There are one or two books in Hebrew, but the story hadn't really been told. It typically gets a few pages or perhaps a chapter in wider histories of the conflict. And I realized that it was a period that was filled with a lot of really complex and compelling characters on all three sides. So that's Jewish, Arab, and British. Of course, this is the British mandate. The British are administering Palestine. And before I continue, I want to issue a couple of disclaimers here. First of all, they both have to do with the title and the cover of the book. I've noticed that for some people, the P word in the title, particularly those of us who are Israeli or friends of Israel, the P word can be a little bit loaded. There's a feeling that it's an Arab word in the same way that Israel is a Jewish or Hebrew word. But of course, there's no political or polemical intent behind the title. It's simply what the Holy Land was called at the time. It was Mandate Palestine. Even the Jews of the time tended to call themselves Palestinian Jews as opposed to the Jews of Europe or elsewhere. And even when talking about the Holy Land at this time, in English, they would say Palestine. Of course, in Hebrew, they would say Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And then the second disclaimer is just about the second line here, 1936. If my publisher had given me a little more room, it might have said Palestine 1936 to 39, because the core of this book is not 1 year, but it's 3 years. It's this very critical period just before the Second World War. So, armed with this knowledge that I had finally found an empty space on the creaking bookshelf of all things Israeli Arab, I set to work and thus began a project that lasted 5 years and took me to archives on 3 continents and in 3 languages, and here we are. Now, my girlfriend and my dear Jewish mother have warned me that in previous events I was giving too much away. I was talking too much, giving away too much of the plot, and I was at risk of both boring people and, even worse, making it so that they would feel they had no need to buy or read the book. They already knew everything. So I will try to avoid that this time, and I'm helped by the fact that I've got limited time here. Now, this is a mostly Jewish audience, I think it's safe to say, not entirely, but mostly. And so I will, by necessity, be focusing on the Jewish side of this particular equation. And I want to really focus in on 3 sort of legacies for Jewish history and for the history of Israel that emerged from this revolt. And these may surprise you, because these are big ones. One is the Jewish state, the very concept, the very notion of a Jewish state. This is when it first appears on the international agenda. Not a Jewish national home, as stipulated in the Balfour Declaration, but a real live Jewish state. The second is a Jewish army. This is when the roots of the IDF are sown, and I'll get into all of these in a moment. And then the third, which is particularly relevant here a few days after Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. This is when the gates, the last open gate for the Jews of Europe, the persecuted Jews of Europe, were closed right before the Holocaust, right before the Shoah. So this revolt was Arab, of course, but I argue that this is as much, if not more, a Jewish story even than an Arab one. I argue that the Jewish counter-revolt is a kind of critical and forgotten piece in the history of this conflict. Now, if I had a little more time, I would get into a little more of the historical context pre-revolt. Of course, we've got the Balfour Declaration in 1917, in which Britain expresses its support for a Jewish national home in Palestine. We've got the Hebron riots of 1929, and I've actually lost track of how many times when I start telling people about this book, they say, oh, Hebron, right? No, this is not about Hebron. The core of my book begins 7 years after Hebron. The Hebron massacre was a grim and gruesome outburst of terrorism that lasted a few days, in which 133 Jews were killed. But I believe, and I argue in this book, that that's all that it was. It was an outburst. It was terrorism. It was an outburst of riots. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Is the sound okay? All right. It was an outburst of terrorism and of riots, but it was not a sustained nationalist uprising, an intifada in the parlance of today. The first time that we see anything like that, you probably guessed it by now, is 1936. How does the revolt begin? There was a man by the name his name actually will be familiar to many of you. His name was Izz ad-Din al-Qassam. Of course, that's the name. The Qassam brigades are the armed wing of Hamas. Qassam rockets are the rockets that Hamas fires at Israel, or one form of rockets. So there was this man, Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, who was a preacher. He was a jihadi preacher. And he was originally from Syria. He was wanted by the French authorities up there for causing trouble. He came down to Haifa in the early 20s, and he's preaching jihad. He's preaching at the Istiqlal Mosque in Haifa, which you can still visit. It's still an active mosque. You can still visit if you're Muslim, probably not that relevant to most of us here, but you can still, and Qassam is preaching to the urban Muslim poor of Haifa, and again, he's preaching jihad against both British imperialism and Zionism. There's this notion at the time that it's kind of like a great Satan and a little Satan. It's kind of a two-headed monster, and if you can take down one, you'll take down the other. And he's preaching things like, you know, when the British officer presents his shoe for you to polish, don't take out your brush, take out your pistol, and that sort of thing. And so his followers wage a few sporadic attacks, some of which are deadly. They kill a Jewish member of the Palestine police by the name of Moshe Rosenfeld, and now they are a wanted man because they've killed a servant of the British crown. And so the Palestine police chase after him, they pursue him, and they kill him in the forests of northern Palestine, now northern Israel. And this is the first sort of Palestinian martyr in the Palestinian Arab pantheon. And Ben-Gurion, who even at this time, David Ben-Gurion, even at this time, he's the undisputed leader of the Jews of Palestine, or the Yishuv, as David said, as we say in Hebrew, the pre-state Jewish community. David Ben-Gurion recognizes the significance of this event immediately. He says, finally, for the first time, we've seen an Arab who's willing to lay down his life for a cause. And he predicted correctly, as Ben-Gurion tended to, he predicted that there would be hundreds or thousands more like him. And so a few months later, early 1936, April 1936, a few of Qassam's acolytes ambush some Jews on the roads near Nablus. Probably sounds familiar. It sounds like it could be ripped from the headlines today, but there's a 70-year-old chicken merchant from Salonika who, along with his young driver from Tel Aviv, are ambushed and they're killed. And these are really the opening shots of the revolt. This is April 15th, 1936. And the revolt begins with violence, but very soon becomes accompanied with political demands as well. And there's a man who many of you will know, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who notoriously, a few years down the road, would spend World War II at Hitler's side in Berlin. But at this point, he's still more or less on the good side of the British, and Hajj Amin declares a strike. He declares that the Arabs will be boycotting the British, will be boycotting the Jews completely until several demands are met. Stopping Jewish immigration, a ban on land sales, because of course many prominent Arabs are selling land quite happily to the Jews at inflated prices, even while they rail against the practice. So he makes these demands and says the general strike will continue until these demands are met. And it bears fruit because the British send a royal commission acting in the name of the king, in this case the very short-lived King Edward VIII, who famously abdicates to marry an American divorcee. He sends this commission, which is known to history as the Peel Commission, and they're in the country for several months. They speak to dozens of Jews, dozens of British officials. The Jews come with the 1937 equivalent of PowerPoints and Excel sheets and prezis. They're very well organized, as Jews tend to be. The Mufti is boycotting the commission because they haven't agreed to his demands, but ultimately at the 11th hour he relents and he testifies as well. And they go back to England and they produce a 400-page report, which if anyone has nothing at all going on in the month of May, I suggest they read, because it's a really good read. It's a lot of context, it's well written. But history remembers this report, above all, for its last 10 or 15 pages, in which it recommends a two-state solution, including a Jewish state. And this particular map, which I'm sure many of you have seen, they give the Jews sort of the coast from Rehovot up and the Galilee as well, which at the time is overwhelmingly Arab, by the way. This map becomes the template for every two-state solution subsequent. So that's from the UN's partition plan 10 years later on to all the various partition and two-state solution plans we've had since. And Ben-Gurion is euphoric. He kind of pretends, maybe yes, maybe no, he plays coy, but I've seen his diaries, and he's completely euphoric. He calls it a second Balfour Declaration. He says, we have to thank the Mufti for starting this revolt in the first place. He was ecstatic, and so was Chaim Weizmann, who was the head of the World Zionist Organization. There's a raucous debate within the Jewish community about whether to accept, whether to not accept the right-wing sort of dissident movement of Vladimir Jabotinsky, rejects it out of hand, and a few left-wing Zionists as well, but Ben-Gurion and Weizmann carried the day. The Mufti, unsurprisingly, rejects this out of hand. He calls it an amputation, a degradation, a humiliation, and that's that at the moment. And everyone's waiting to see if Britain actually implements this, actually goes through with it. But a few months later, I told you guys I wasn't going to tell you everything that happens, but here we are. A few months later, there's a man named Lewis Andrews, who's a fascinating character. He's the governor of Galilee. He's an Australian, actually. He's a Christian Zionist. He's one of very few British officials who actually learns Hebrew with any proficiency. Also has excellent Arabic. So this Mr. Andrews is assassinated on his 41st birthday while attending church in Nazareth. I have a special sympathy for Mr. Andrews because my 41st birthday is coming up in a couple of weeks. But he's killed tragically, and the revolt is back on, and it's more destructive and more violent than ever. The Mufti flees to Beirut. Some sources say dressed as a woman, others say dressed as a Bedouin. I happen to believe it was dressed as a Bedouin, but we can discuss later. And the Mufti flees because he is seen correctly as the puppeteer, as the one pulling the strings of the revolt. The British and Jewish intelligence, which is just beginning, it's quite clear to them, and indeed to most Arabs, that it's the Mufti who's ultimately pulling the strings of violence here. So he flees to Lebanon, and the revolt is raging. But the British have a problem. The war clouds are gathering above Europe, and the British are unable to send large numbers of men to Palestine. It seems to be a question of when and not if the world is going to go to war with Hitler. So what do? They agree to a long-standing Jewish demand to arm the Jews in large numbers. And this gets us to our second great legacy of this revolt. The British, which are, of course, the preeminent military power in the world at this point, the British arm and train something like 15 or 20,000 Jews into something called the Jewish Supernumerary Police. In Hebrew, we say the Notrim. And so they're given British weapons, they're given British training, they're given British salaries, but it's quite clear to everyone that they're in fact answerable to the Haganah. The Haganah is the main Jewish armed force at this time, which is technically illegal, but tolerated as long as they behave themselves and limit themselves to self-defense. And again, this is the birth of the IDF. This is when the seed of a Jewish army is sown. This is also the period of Ord Wingate, another fascinating character. Again, a Christian Zionist, but even more importantly, a military genius. And he launches something called the Special Night Squads, which is really the first Jewish special forces. And they go on the offensive, they act at night. And this is the seed of the IDF officer corps. These are men like Moshe Dayan, Yigal Alon. And so this is really the peak of the revolt. This is mid-1938. The Brits finally appease Hitler at Munich, and they and Europe breathe a sigh of relief. And at that point, they send large numbers of men to Palestine and engage in very, very heavy-handed or brutal, you could choose your adjective, repressive measures. In fact, the cover of the book is from Old Jaffa. I'm sure many of you have been to Old Jaffa. There's a beautiful, wide passageway there. That's what's going on right here. They destroyed. There were snipers and terrorism coming from Old Jaffa, and they simply destroyed a huge swath of it. And so yeah, so the British take highly repressive measures. We're talking curfews, checkpoints, house demolitions. 2,000 homes are demolished in this period. They even build a security wall on the border with Lebanon because the Mufti is sending down militants, and there's a clear parallel there to the separation wall in the West Bank today. So many of kind of the most controversial methods that the IDF takes today are really the inheritance, or trace both their legal, both the methods and the legal basis thereof, you can trace back to this period of the British counter-revolt. Of course, the State of Israel inherited many laws from its British predecessor. The IDF is modeled on the British Army in many ways. In fact, the British Army went much further than the IDF could ever dream of, even in the minds of its most radical members of certain governments, because the British collective punishment was simply part of the game at this point. If there was a bomb laid on a highway, the British would come in, take out the Mukhtar, the village headman, say, okay, who did it? And if he couldn't tell them, they would start demolishing homes, willy-nilly, as the Brits say. And so the British are starting to get a handle on this revolt, and it's starting to sort of, they're getting it on the ropes, and they're helped by just a massive convulsion of Arab infighting, and this is also kind of a precursor to later history. But there's a huge convulsion of just score settling and intra-Arab fighting, much of it driven by the Mufti in exile, but not all of it. And there's just a tremendous amount of bad blood and score settling that's really destroying the social fabric on the Arab side. But the Brits are determined to wrestle this revolt to the ground, and in their endless appetite for commissions, committees, and conferences, they call something called the St. James's Conference at St. James's Palace in London. And they invite the Jews, they invite the Arabs, and the conclusion of this conference is essentially is already known ahead of time. This is a period of appeasement. This is the government of Neville Chamberlain. And the word appeasement wasn't only used by critics of appeasement like Winston Churchill. It was essentially official government policy, and it extended beyond just dealing with the Nazis and the fascists. You can see in the cabinet papers that they talk about appeasing Arab and Muslim opinion. They were particularly worried about Muslim opinion in India. That, of course, includes Pakistan and Bangladesh of today. They were worried that if a world war broke out and the Muslims of India were not on Britain's side, that it would cause a lot of problems. And so they determined to go as far as they possibly can to appease Arab opinion over Palestine. And the result of this is the infamous White Paper of 1939, which severely curtails Jewish immigration. This is already mid-1939, right? So a critical time. And if the Jewish immigration is limited to 75,000 in total over 10 years, 5 years, excuse me. Now, if we recall that in the early 1930s, in 1935, 60,000 Jews came to the land of Israel. And now the Brits have determined that 75,000 can come over 5 years total. And this is at a period when Jews are desperate to flee Nazi Germany, certainly, but also anti-Semitic movements in Poland, Hungary, Romania, across Europe. So really, this is a reneging on not just the Peel partition plan, but this is a reneging on the Balfour Declaration itself. And there's some very tragic scenes that I uncovered in my research here. There's a Zionist conference that's held, this biannual Zionist Congress that's held in Geneva in August '39. And they get news of the Hitler-Stalin non-aggression pact, which means that basically there's no barrier to Hitler doing what he wants with Eastern Europe and with the massive Jewish population of Poland. And so they get word of this agreement, and they wrap up the conference very quickly. And there are very moving scenes of the delegates standing up and singing Hatikva with tears in their eyes. And of course, most of these people are never seen again because the war breaks out a week later. And we know how that ends. So there's a huge what if there. What if the British had gone through with this two-state solution? What if there had been a Jewish state, however small, in 1937? What if the White Paper hadn't been passed? I think it's probably too much to say that 6 million Jews could have been saved. I think Palestine was, particularly the Jewish Palestine that was offered, was probably too small to absorb that many people. And I think most Jews probably didn't recognize the enormity of what was to come. But could hundreds of thousands of Jews have been saved? Probably. I think that's a plausible reading of history. So I'm just going to sum up a little bit more about the effects and the legacy. There were 500 Jews were killed in this revolt. These are huge numbers. These are the numbers that we saw in the Second Intifada many years later, when, of course, the population was much greater. So there's a tremendous cost in blood and in treasure for the Jews. But Ben-Gurion was an expert in turning adversity to advantage. We already talked about the military gains that the Jews made, that the Yishuv made. Economically, the revolt directly served Ben-Gurion's goal, his long-standing goal, of creating a self-sufficient Jewish economy that could feed itself, that could house itself, employ itself. This is the period when Tel Aviv port opens up. The Arabs closed down Jaffa port, and so in May 36, Ben-Gurion asked the Brits to open up a Jewish port, and he's ecstatic. He talks about it again as a second Balfour Declaration, when the British say yes. Many of you have probably been to Namal Tel Aviv, had a drink or a coffee there. This is all from this very same period. So economic, industrial self-sufficiency. In terms of settlements, there are strategic points that go up all over the country for the Jews. Not a single settlement is abandoned. This is the period of wall and tower as well, or tower and stockade. There was an old Ottoman law that if you built a structure over 24 hours, it could stay up. And so the Jews took advantage of this, and they built settlements in strategic parts of the country. So really, the Jews create the springboard in this period for militarily, economically, politically, demographically, even philosophically. This is just a period of tremendous motivation and unity on the Jewish side. The springboard for the state that they would create 10 years down the road. And then for the Arabs, it's the mirror image of this reality. The revolt that aimed to crush Zionism instead crushed the Arabs themselves. You had thousands of Arabs killed, at least 5,000, so 10 times the number of the Jews, perhaps as many as 8,000, many of them by their fellow Arabs or by British force of arms. The British hang 100 Arabs, they demolish 2,000 homes, as I mentioned. You've got a huge wave of refugees beyond the borders of Palestine, so again, another preview of what was to come in 48. You've got the leadership exiled, the Arab leadership. So really, the Arab social fabric is just completely torn. And what I argue in this book is that really the final reckoning, the final battle for Palestine, for Israel of 1948 was really won by one side and lost by another. I'm talking about the sort of the civil war between Jews and Arabs within Palestine. It was really won by one side, lost by another, almost 10 years in advance. And I hope that those of you who do read the book will kind of agree with perhaps my central argument or my proposition in this book, which is that this revolt very much rages on even today for both sides, for Israelis and for Palestinians. Now, I want to close here by David asked me, he said, I know there's a lot of, I'm paraphrasing here, David. He said, I know there's a lot of death and destruction and conflict and tragedy in this book, but if you could just find a little ray of light, please do. And so here goes. As we look back about 85 years later, Israel is at peace with 6 Arab states, right? Egypt and Jordan, and then just a few years ago, we added 4 more to that list. High-tech power, third most companies on NASDAQ, that's more than India, Japan, and Korea combined. Per capita GDP, higher than the former imperial power of the United Kingdom, higher than France, higher than Canada, pretty good. And then finally, and probably most importantly, we've got a Jewish population of about 7 million as we passed at the end of last year. Now, in this period that I'm writing about, the Jews in their wildest dreams would talk about 1 million, 2 million, 3 million Jews in the land of Israel. We're up to 7 now in a country of 9 million. So I think just a few days after Yom HaShoah and a few days before Israel's 75th birthday, I think that's something to celebrate. So I'll end there and happy to continue the discussion later on. So thanks very much. And Shabbat Shalom.